A corrupt and racist judge fined a black woman out of pure prejudice and humiliated her in court, but what he didn't know was that she was a legal genius, and what happened to that judge left everyone shocked. She walked into that courtroom with the quiet dignity of someone queuing for the truth, not realizing she was about to be torn apart by the very system she believed in. It was supposed to be a simple hearing. A minor traffic incident, barely a moving violation. She had all her documents, photos, even GPS data. She came prepared, calm, respectful. What she wasn't prepared for was the man behind the bench, a man cloaked in law but fueled by something far more sinister, contempt for people like her. Contempt masked as formality, dripping from every word he spoke like venom dressed in velvet. "I suppose you think you know more about the law than I do," he said, smirking. He didn't wait for an answer. He looked around the courtroom and chuckled like he was putting on a show. Typical. You people always have something to say. She blinked, stunned. "Excuse me." Her voice was steady, not sharp. Not angry. But the silence that fell afterward, the way heads turned, how people held their breath, that silence knew exactly what she'd heard. She wasn't imagining it. He leaned back in his chair, tilting it just enough to look bored. "That'll be a $500 contempt of court fine. Maybe that'll teach you to watch your tone in front of a judge." The audience shifted. A few jaws dropped. No one spoke. She stood there, lips parting like she might say something, anything, but there was no air left in her chest. Her heart thundered in her ears, drowning out her thoughts. This wasn't just a fine. It wasn't just about her tone. It was a public flogging masked as law. And he'd done it with a smile. But what he didn't know, what no one in that courtroom realized, was that she had spent the last 10 years of her life immersed in legal texts, federal codes, constitutional rights, and court precedents. Not as a lawyer yet. No. But as someone who had grown up watching her community get steamrolled by that same system. She knew the law because the law had always been used against her. And people like her. He thought he'd silenced her. He thought he'd embarrassed her into submission. But what he did was wake something fierce. That moment, the sting of that fine, the echo of that laughter, the weight of the silence as she walked out of the courtroom, that moment rewrote her future. He wasn't just any judge. He had a history. Complaints filed and ignored. Whispers in the halls of law schools, bar associations, minority advocacy groups. Stories that never quite made it into the press. But now, someone was watching. Someone with a memory like steel and a mind trained like a blade. She started digging, connecting dots, following trails others had missed, or maybe had been too afraid to trace. And as she built her quiet case, brick by brick, the same courthouse that once made her shrink would become her battlefield. The judge? He would never see it coming. The law that he thought he owned. It was about to turn on him. She wasn't interested in revenge. This wasn't personal. It was structural. It was historical. It was necessary. Because when she walked back into that courthouse months later, she wasn't the same woman who had been silenced. She was something else entirely. And the bench he used to mock her from? It would soon become the same place he'd have to answer for crimes far greater than contempt. But how did she manage to take down a judge so protected, so untouchable, so embedded in the power structure? What weapon did she use that turned the entire legal system upside down? And why did the entire courtroom stand in stunned silence the moment she dropped the final piece of evidence? There's one moment, one decision, that changed everything. And it's the kind of twist that makes you question who really holds the power in a courtroom. Are you ready to hear what really happened when the law turned against the man who abused it for too long? Because the truth is far more shocking than anyone ever expected. It started on a Wednesday morning in Birmingham, Alabama, when the late summer heat had already begun to press against the city like a weight too heavy to bear. The courthouse on 7th Avenue loomed like an indifferent monument, its stone exterior cracked by time but untouched by justice. People passed its steps every day, some entering with hope, most leaving with disappointment. Inside, the atmosphere was sterile, rehearsed, almost theatrical. And yet, behind that ritualistic coldness, lives were unraveling. Among them, one woman's presence was about to ripple through the building like an unexpected storm, soft in its arrival, but relentless in its force. Her name was Danielle Brooks. 36 years old. Born and raised in West End, one of the city's oldest black neighborhoods. She was the daughter of a single mother who cleaned offices downtown and a father she never met. From a young age, Danielle had been one of those kids who asked too many questions. She questioned her teachers, her pastors, her mother's exhaustion, the empty fridges, the silent glances exchanged during school meetings. She didn't grow up with luxuries, far from it. What she had was a curious mind and a gnawing awareness that the world didn't quite add up the way they said it did. And because of that, she learned to observe. To remember. To analyze people and systems like puzzles missing pieces. Life had taught her that speaking too much could get you ignored, or worse. So Danielle learned to listen instead. By 20, she was the first in her family to attend college, working full-time while pursuing a degree in sociology. But it wasn't until she sat through a criminal justice seminar during her junior year that something shifted inside her. The professor, a tall woman with silver streaks in her locks and a piercing stare, had said something Danielle would never forget: law is not justice. Law is the structure. Justice is how we bend it. From that day on, Danielle knew what she was meant to do. She wanted to know the structure inside out. Not to play the game, but to decode it. Maybe even to burn it down and build it better. After graduating, she didn't go straight to law school like most people in her position might. Instead, she chose to work, first in legal aid clinics, then as a paralegal for a public defender, then in nonprofit housing law. She filed paperwork for clients who couldn't read, sat beside mothers sobbing into custody hearing verdicts, and helped tenants stay one more month in apartments where the ceiling leaked and mold grew like moss. She watched judges roll their eyes at families. She saw lawyers pretend not to hear when people mispronounced subpoena. She studied, quietly and obsessively. She read every night. She annotated case law with more care than most law students. She knew the language, the loopholes, the cadence of courtroom arrogance. And she learned, most painfully, how deep the unspoken rules ran, especially when you were poor. And especially when you were black. Still, she kept her head down and her work sharp. She didn't argue unless she had to. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make enemies. Danielle wasn't interested in becoming a martyr. She was interested in becoming unstoppable. Which brings us to that morning in court, when she stood at the defendant's table over what should have been an administrative hearing about a traffic citation. A minor stop sign violation near a school zone, no collision, no injuries, just an automated camera ticket that she believed had been issued in error. She had reviewed the city ordinances. She had time-stamped footage from a nearby gas station camera showing her braking at the correct line. She even had a printed excerpt from the city's own legal code proving that the camera in that location had not been updated for 2 years, rendering its footage legally questionable. She wasn't just prepared, she was airtight. But preparation meant nothing in Judge Thomas Whitaker's courtroom. Whitaker had sat on the bench for over 20 years. In that time, he had cultivated a reputation as a no-nonsense judge, known for his rigid demeanor and his thinly veiled disdain for defendants who wasted the court's time. Off the record, lawyers of color often referred to his courtroom as the trap, a place where minor infractions became financial quagmires, and respect had to be earned by groveling. But no one spoke openly. Not because they didn't care, but because in cities like Birmingham, some men's power grows too intertwined with the system to challenge. He was already flipping through her documents before she could finish introducing herself. He sighed. Loudly. A performance for the clerk, the bailiff, the sparse gallery behind her. You came in here to challenge a traffic ticket, he said, glancing at her over his glasses. Yes, Your Honor. I believe there's a factual error. I'll stop you right there, he interrupted. This court doesn't have time for citizens playing lawyer. Danielle opened her mouth, carefully choosing not to frown. I'm not playing, sir. The footage, you people always come in here thinking the rules don't apply to you, he said flatly, waving a hand toward the documents. And now you're wasting taxpayer time with your little Google search and your cell phone videos. It took her a second to realize what he had just said. You people. Not defendants. Not drivers. You people. A quiet settled over the courtroom, the kind that only comes when something unspoken has just been said aloud. Danielle stood a little straighter. She didn't say a word. Her silence, however, did what her voice couldn't. It unsettled him. He hated that she wasn't crying, that she wasn't groveling, that her stillness looked like defiance. I'm fining you $500 for contempt, he said suddenly. And you can take that attitude somewhere else. Danielle didn't move. Her throat tightened. Her hands curled into the edges of the defendant's table. Not because of the money, though she certainly didn't have $500 to spare. But because he had done it so casually. Because in 2 sentences, he'd stripped her dignity and made it look like due process. The clerk looked down awkwardly. The bailiff shifted. No one looked at her. She gathered her papers without a word and walked out. Outside, the sun was blinding. The cars passed, indifferent. No one stopped to ask what had happened. Danielle sat on the steps of the courthouse for 20 minutes before standing again. She wasn't sure where the anger stopped and the strategy began, but something inside her was already recalculating. This wasn't going to end here. Whitaker went back to his docket. Another name. Another case. Another chance to remind the room that power didn't need to scream to be absolute. But what he didn't realize, what he could never have imagined, was that he had just picked the wrong woman to humiliate. And in a few months, the same courtroom where he had smirked at her would become the stage of a reckoning he never saw coming. Because Danielle Brooks was not the kind of woman you buried with shame. She was the kind of woman who planted seeds in that soil. And when they bloomed, they'd crack the concrete. The days after the courtroom humiliation stretched like a slow burn across Danielle's skin, constant and inescapable. She went back to work, kept her head down in the office, nodded through client meetings, filed motions with precision. But every time she closed her eyes, she was back in that room, standing in front of that bench, staring up at a man who wore the law like a weapon, swinging it at her with a smug grin. And the worst part wasn't the fine. It wasn't even the insult. It was that no one had stopped him. The silence of the clerk, the stillness of the bailiff, the way the people behind her averted their eyes. It was a silence she knew too well, one that fed on fear and familiarity. She had seen it before, in housing offices, in hospital lobbies, in school board meetings. But this time, she couldn't walk away. At night, Danielle would sit at her kitchen table long after her daughter had gone to bed, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the apartment. She started combing through public records, beginning with his sentencing patterns, then his disciplinary history, digging into civil complaints, court audits, ethics filings. She requested transcripts. She made spreadsheets. At first, it was an act of emotional survival. But soon, it became something more. Patterns began to emerge, disparities so stark they could no longer be dismissed as anecdotal. White defendants with multiple violations received deferred judgments while black defendants with identical infractions were fined heavily or jailed. Women who spoke too confidently in his courtroom were cited for contempt. Public defenders described him off-record as impossible to argue with, arbitrary, dangerous. One Friday afternoon, she walked into the office of her longtime colleague and friend, Malik Jones, who had worked as a public defender for almost a decade. His desk was buried in case files and half-empty coffee cups, but when she closed the door behind her and set a thick folder on his desk, he raised an eyebrow. You finally collecting receipts on someone? He asked, half joking. She didn't smile. I want you to look at these numbers. Don't say anything yet. Malik flipped through the printouts. At first, his face was unreadable. But the more he read, the tighter his jaw clenched. When he reached the spreadsheet comparing sentence lengths by race and gender, he pushed back in his chair and stared at her. Danielle, you know if you go after him, it's not just about him. You're gonna be pulling on a whole web. You ready for that? She didn't hesitate. I don't care how thick the web is. It's time someone burned it. The conversation unlocked something between them. Malik opened his files. He started pulling cases, one after the other, people whose stories mirrored Danielle's own. A mother fined for speaking out during a custody hearing. A college student cited for disrespectful tone during a speeding ticket dispute. Danielle began tracking down those people, knocking on doors, meeting them in diners, community centers, parks. Each story added another layer. She wasn't alone. They weren't isolated incidents. This was a pattern. This was systemic. One woman, a retired teacher named Gloria who had once been humiliated in court for her southern dialect, gripped Danielle's hand after their meeting and whispered, "We tried before. We filed complaints. No one ever listened. You really think you can make them hear you now?" Danielle nodded slowly. "Not me. Us. If we're loud enough, they'll have to." But gathering stories wasn't enough. She needed credibility. She needed pressure. And that meant bringing in someone the system couldn't ignore. That's when she called Angela Moreno, a legal ethics professor she had once interned under, now a well-respected figure in judicial oversight. Angela was skeptical at first. She'd heard stories about Whitaker for years, but nothing had ever stuck. But when Danielle handed her a binder with timelines, transcripts, affidavits, and statistical breakdowns, Angela stared at it in stunned silence. This is undeniable," she said finally. "You didn't just build a case, Danielle. You built a bomb." Angela offered her institutional support, guidance on how to file a formal judicial complaint with the Alabama Judicial Inquiry Commission, and how to approach legal media outlets. But the professor also warned her, "If you go public, Danielle, they will come for you. They will discredit you, dig into your life, question your intentions. Are you ready to be the face of this?" Danielle swallowed hard. "I'm not doing this for recognition. I'm doing it so no one else has to go through what I did." Meanwhile, Judge Whitaker remained blissfully unaware. He carried on with his usual arrogance, berating defendants, cutting off lawyers mid-sentence, signing off on questionable fines. He was surrounded by people who had learned not to challenge him. But Danielle wasn't one of them anymore. It was Malik who brought her the final push she didn't know she needed. He'd gotten access to internal memos and anonymous testimonies from junior clerks, stories about forged timestamps on court documents, cases deliberately buried or delayed, defense motions mysteriously lost. And at the center of it all, Whitaker. Danielle took everything and built a dossier thicker than a phone book. Angela reviewed it page by page. Malik rehearsed interviews with her, prepping her for public statements. They set up a press conference. The legal aid office buzzed with nervous energy. And just days before the formal complaint was to be filed, Danielle received a letter, anonymous, no return address. Inside were copies of bank statements. They showed payments made to Whitaker from a private probation company. Small at first, then growing over time. Kickbacks. It was the missing link. Her hands trembled as she held the papers. She looked up at Malik, who had read them over her shoulder. "You realize what this means," he said. "He's not just abusive. He's dirty." Danielle nodded. "And we're going to expose him." As they prepared the final package, word began to leak. Quietly at first. A law blogger posted an anonymous tip. A local reporter reached out asking for comment. And then the whispers began spreading through the courthouse. Clerks grew silent when Danielle passed. Public defenders nodded at her with cautious approval. Whitaker, sensing some shift in the air, grew even more combative on the bench. Then, one morning, Danielle walked into the courthouse not as a defendant, not as an observer, but as a woman holding the weight of dozens of voices behind her. In her bag, she carried the complaint, the evidence, the testimonies. It was time. But before she could even reach the Judicial Commission office, her phone rang. It was Angela. Her voice was tight, urgent. "Danielle, something's happened. You need to see this." Danielle rushed to the office where Angela had pulled up a news alert on her laptop. Her eyes scanned the headline once. Then twice. Then she read it out loud. State Judge Thomas Whitaker accused of receiving illegal payments from private probation firm. Federal inquiry underway. She stared at the screen in disbelief. The story had broken early, too early. Someone had leaked it. Angela shook her head. This wasn't us. Someone beat us to it. And it's about to explode. Danielle's mind raced. If the feds were involved, things were bigger than she thought. She had aimed to reveal a pattern of racial and gender bias, but now the case had morphed into something else, something that could bring down more than just a single judge. Whitaker was only the first domino. Behind him, there were officials, attorneys, financial ties no one had seen coming. And suddenly, the story was no longer just about her. It was about a corrupt ecosystem cracking open at the seams. But who leaked the story before her? Who else had known? Danielle would soon find out that someone from within the court had been watching her, quietly rooting for her, and had decided to strike first, to force the system's hand, to set the wheels in motion before anyone could stop it. Now, the entire city was about to witness something no one expected, the fall of a man who thought he was untouchable, and the rise of a woman who refused to be silenced. But what will happen when Danielle is summoned back into the courtroom, this time, not as a defendant, but as the woman whose voice might finally dismantle a legacy of injustice? And what shocking twist awaits her when she comes face to face with Whitaker for the last time? The courtroom is ready. The truth is about to be heard. The building felt colder than usual. Not in temperature, but in silence, the kind of silence that hangs heavy in the air before something irreversible happens. Danielle stood in the hallway outside courtroom 3B, her back straight, her heels still against the polished floor. The hallway was emptier than usual, but she could feel the tension humming around her like static. At the end of the corridor, a few reporters loitered under the guise of checking their phones. One of them glanced at her, eyes narrowing as if trying to match her face to the story they had printed that morning. But Danielle didn't flinch. She had been invisible long enough to know when to let herself be seen. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with a different kind of energy. It was rare that a sitting judge was summoned before an ethics board hearing, and even rarer that it happened publicly. Rows of seats were filled, advocates, attorneys, community leaders, students. People who remembered what had been done to them, or people they loved. The weight of collective memory was thick in the air. At the front sat the panel, 3 judges, 1 retired prosecutor, and 1 state-appointed ethics advisor. They looked calm, composed, unreadable. Danielle took a slow breath before stepping in. When she entered, a few heads turned. Some eyes widened. Others softened. Malik, sitting 2 rows from the front, gave her a single nod, subtle, but enough. Angela, seated beside him, scribbled something in her notebook without looking up. Danielle didn't search the room for him. She already knew where he'd be. And there he was, Judge Thomas Whitaker, sitting at the defense table, no longer cloaked in the robe that once gave him untouchable authority. He wore a gray suit that looked expensive but ill-fitting, like it belonged to another version of him, one that hadn't yet cracked. His face was tired, eyes sharp but shadowed, a man still pretending he had control. Beside him sat a defense attorney, a man Danielle recognized from high-profile corruption cases, someone known for spinning narratives out of broken truths. But this time, there were no stories to spin. The facts had come too fast. The pressure too strong. And the one person who had every right to speak was finally being given a platform that couldn't be muted. The clerk called the hearing to order. The room settled. Danielle was summoned to the witness chair. As she sat, the panel chair spoke, his voice steady and formal. "Ms. Brooks, you understand the nature of this hearing?" She nodded. "I do. You've submitted documentation, testimony, and corroborated evidence pertaining to Judge Whittaker's conduct over a period of 12 years. Today, you've been asked to summarize your findings and answer any questions the board may have." Danielle took another breath, then turned her eyes, not to the panel, but to the man across the room who once laughed in her face. "I didn't come here to destroy a man's career," she began, her voice even, though her chest thudded. "I came here because I believed in a system that was supposed to protect us. I believed it when it said justice was blind. When it said truth mattered. But that belief was tested the day I walked into your courtroom, Judge Whittaker." He shifted in his seat. His lawyer leaned in to whisper something, but Danielle kept going. "I was penalized not for breaking the law, but for challenging the ego of a man who had forgotten what his role was. I stood there, prepared, informed, respectful. And I was punished. But I wasn't the first. And I wouldn't have been the last." She laid out the facts, quietly, clearly. Case after case. Numbers. Names. Patterns. Statements from colleagues. Internal documents. She recited it like someone who had memorized the anatomy of a system's failure. The room hung on every word, each sentence tightening the noose around Whittaker's legacy. Then, when the panel invited questions, Whittaker's attorney stood. "You've done a thorough job, Ms. Brooks," he said, almost sarcastic. "But would you say you hold a personal vendetta against my client?" Danielle didn't blink. "I hold personal accountability against him." "Would you say you're emotionally invested in the outcome of this hearing?" She leaned forward. "I'm emotionally invested in justice. That doesn't disqualify my evidence." He smirked, but she didn't give him time to speak again. She turned to the panel. "If being black and educated and angry discredits me, then we've learned nothing. I am all those things. And I am here because no one else would be." There was a pause, deep and complete, before the panel chair spoke again. "Thank you, Ms. Brooks. Please remain seated. The board will now consider a direct question to Judge Whittaker." Whittaker cleared his throat as he was called to the stand. He walked slowly, his steps deliberate. The man who once barked orders now answered them. When asked about the racial disparities in his sentencing, he said data could be manipulated. When questioned about contempt charges levied disproportionately against women, he called it courtroom discipline. When asked directly about the payments from the probation firm, his voice stumbled. "I had no knowledge of the payments. They were donations to a civic program. I wasn't involved in the bookkeeping." Danielle watched, her face unreadable. But inside, she felt something shifting. This wasn't the man from that day. This was a shadow. A shell. His arrogance was still there, but his certainty was gone. Then came the final blow. The board called a surprise witness, a former clerk named Tasha Rivers. Danielle had only heard of her briefly, through Malik's contacts. No one had been able to reach her until now. Tasha walked in wearing simple clothes and a nervous expression. She sat, trembling slightly, but when she looked at Danielle, she straightened her back. "I worked in Judge Whittaker's office for 3 years," she began. "And I was asked to destroy documents. Court files. Complaints. There were dozens." The room stiffened. "Why did you comply?" the board asked. "Because I was told I'd lose my job. And because I was scared. But I kept copies. I kept everything." She handed a flash drive to the board. Whitaker paled. Danielle didn't move, didn't smile. Her hands stayed folded in her lap. Because this wasn't about vengeance. This was exposure. After the testimony, the board called a recess. Cameras outside the courthouse began broadcasting. Reporters scrambled. Whitaker sat motionless, eyes hollow. As the board deliberated, Malik leaned in close to Danielle and whispered, "They're going to recommend removal." "He's done." She looked ahead, not celebrating. He was done the moment he thought no one would speak. But the moment wasn't over yet. As the panel returned, everyone rose. Whitaker stood as instructed. The chair read their recommendation aloud. Immediate removal pending further investigation. Suspension of legal credentials. Referral for criminal inquiry. The courtroom buzzed. But then, the chair paused. "There's one final matter," he said. "Ms. Brooks, due to the extraordinary diligence, ethical integrity, and legal insight demonstrated in your investigation and presentation, the State Bar Association has voted to formally recognize you as eligible for legal certification upon completion of your pending degree, and has extended an invitation to join a new oversight committee for judicial ethics." Danielle froze. Her breath caught. That wasn't part of any plan. Malik's hand touched her shoulder. Angela whispered, "You just changed the system." And in the back of the room, a woman stood and began clapping. Then another. And another. Until the entire courtroom rose in applause, not just for the outcome, but for the woman who had become the voice they all thought would never be heard. But as Danielle stood, facing the man who once tried to reduce her to silence, one question lingered in the air. Who leaked the story to the press before she did? Because what Danielle didn't know yet was that someone inside the very system had been watching her from the beginning, someone with a secret that would change everything. The crowd had begun to spill out into the marble-floored halls of the courthouse, voices layered with disbelief, triumph, and something else, something quieter, more personal. Vindication. But inside the courtroom, Danielle remained still, her body upright yet heavy, as if the weight of what had just unfolded hadn't fully landed. The sound of applause still echoed faintly in her ears, but her focus had already narrowed onto something else, something gnawing. That unresolved question, the anonymous leak. The sudden, calculated exposure that had forced the board's hand days before she was ready. It had fast-tracked everything. But who had made that move? And why? As the ethics panel recessed and the room slowly emptied, Danielle gathered her things with quiet precision. Malik stayed close, chatting with one of the observers while Angela spoke with the press near the exit. Danielle's eyes swept the room instinctively. Most faces were familiar now. Except one. Near the back row, a woman lingered. Early 50s, perhaps. Tall, with straightened hair pulled into a neat bun. Her eyes were sharp and fixed on Danielle, not with hostility, but with purpose. When their eyes met, the woman gave a single nod and turned to leave. Something in Danielle's chest jolted. She followed. The hallway buzzed with chaos, reporters clicking cameras and chasing sound bites. But the woman moved steadily, avoiding the crowd until she turned a corner and paused near the stairwell exit. Danielle caught up slowly, cautiously. She didn't speak at first. The woman turned and smiled softly. "You were remarkable in there," she said, her voice smooth, calm. Danielle searched her face. "Do I know you?" "No," the woman replied. "But I've known you for a long time." Danielle blinked, unsure whether to be flattered or unnerved. "Did you leak the documents?" The woman gave a small laugh, not cruel, not amused, but like someone who had waited a long time to be asked the right question. "No. Not all of them. But I made sure the right reporter was paying attention. Sometimes the system doesn't fall from the outside, Ms. Brooks. Sometimes it has to be cracked from within." Danielle's stomach tightened. "Why?" The woman took a step closer, her eyes glinting with something unspoken. Because I worked under Whitaker for 6 years. Because I watched too many brilliant, articulate, innocent people walk out of that courtroom destroyed. And I said nothing. I was afraid, like the others. I needed someone braver than me to strike first. Danielle's voice dropped. You were in his chambers. I was his administrative clerk, the woman nodded. He trusted me. Too much. I saw what he did to you. I watched from behind a door that was cracked open. I never forgot your face. Danielle swallowed hard. You leaked the financials. I made sure someone found them, the woman said carefully. And I made sure they were sent to a reporter I knew would dig without warning. I didn't want the system to have time to bury you. Danielle stepped back, overwhelmed. It had always felt like she was alone in the fight, carving her way through stone with a fingernail. But this woman had been a shadow, guiding the storm behind the scenes. Why now? She asked. The woman's smile faltered, her voice suddenly fragile. Because I'm sick. And because I've lived too long knowing I helped keep a monster in power. I wanted to see him fall before I go. There was silence. A silence so full it didn't need to be filled. Danielle nodded slowly. She didn't ask the woman's name. She didn't need to. Later that night, back in her apartment, Danielle sat on the edge of her bed. Her daughter, Ava, was asleep in the next room, unaware of the whirlwind her mother had just weathered. Danielle stared at the ceiling, the noise of the day replaying over and over. She didn't feel victorious. Not exactly. She felt hollow and full at once. There was peace, but it was complicated. She pulled out her laptop, the screen glowing softly in the dark. Her inbox was overflowing, news outlets, legal organizations, messages of support, requests for interviews. But one name caught her eye. It was from a former student at the law clinic, someone she had mentored years ago. The message was short. You made us believe again. She stared at those 6 words until her eyes blurred. And then, almost like muscle memory, she opened a new document and began typing, her statement to the city, her version of what had happened. She would not let others control the narrative. Not this time. The following week, the Department of Justice announced a broader inquiry into judicial misconduct across the state. Whitaker's name was only the first on the list. Whispers turned into headlines. Judges began lawyering up. Clerks resigned. Danielle's testimony was being cited in every article, every radio segment, every panel discussion. But she kept her focus. One morning, she received a letter, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a note. Just 2 lines, you didn't just change the system. You saved lives. Thank you. Tears filled her eyes. Because for so long, she had fought to be heard. And now, people were listening. But the story wasn't over. A week after Whitaker's removal, Danielle was invited to speak at a legal symposium. The event was packed, law students, professors, attorneys, even a few members of the judicial board. She stood at the podium, the microphone adjusting slightly as she cleared her throat. She wasn't nervous. Not anymore. I came into a courtroom as a defendant, she began, but I left as a witness. Not just to one man's abuse of power, but to a system that allows it to thrive. We talk about reform as if it's theoretical. But for some of us, it's not a concept, it's survival. And what happened in that courtroom wasn't just a case. It was a reckoning. As she spoke, she scanned the crowd. Near the back, she caught sight of Tasha Rivers, the former clerk who had testified. She gave Danielle a nod, one that didn't ask for recognition but offered solidarity. And then, beside her, another familiar figure. It was the woman from the stairwell. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Because sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it moves in shadows, passed between hands, whispered through cracked doors. And sometimes, it takes just one person standing up, so that others know they can, too. Danielle finished her speech and stepped down from the stage. And in that moment, the sound of applause didn't feel like validation. It felt like a promise. The days following the hearing unfolded like an aftershock, subtle tremors that still carried force beneath the surface. The headlines didn't slow, if anything they multiplied. Each news cycle seemed to uncover another layer of corruption, another name implicated, another community rallying behind the systemic unraveling that Danielle's courage had ignited. But within that storm of recognition and noise, Danielle felt herself pulled into a quieter, more internal chaos. Not the chaos of fear, but of reflection. The kind that comes not when you're in the fight, but when you finally pause long enough to consider what the fight cost you, what it might continue to take. The city seemed to look at her differently now. On the streets, strangers nodded in her direction, some stopping her to say thank you, others simply staring as if memorizing her face. It was admiration, yes, but also expectation. She had become a symbol. And symbols don't get to rest. But Danielle was not a monument. She was a woman who had nearly collapsed under the weight of silence and chose instead to become the voice that cracked it. That kind of transformation doesn't happen without consequence. One afternoon, she found herself walking through the corridors of the courthouse again, not the main one, where the hearing had taken place, but the smaller administrative building where internal affairs now operated. She had been asked to sit on a temporary advisory board to help identify potential judicial reform measures, and while part of her wanted nothing more than to walk away and start fresh, another part couldn't let go. It was the same courthouse, same faded paint, same hum of fluorescent lights, but something was different. The deference was gone. People weren't walking on eggshells around the institution anymore. There was a new atmosphere. One that crackled with questions instead of fear. In a small conference room upstairs, she met with a panel of legal scholars and community advocates. Most of them were new faces, appointed in the wake of the scandal to ensure impartiality, but there was one who caught her off guard, Judge Sarah Compton. A senior judge with decades on the bench, Compton had a reputation for her icy courtroom demeanor and rigid interpretations of the law. Danielle had sat in her court once years earlier and remembered feeling invisible. So seeing her now, on a reform panel, was jarring. As the meeting began, Danielle listened carefully as the conversation turned toward the question of disbarment and restitution. The board was debating how to handle the ongoing damage caused by the cases Whitaker had ruled over, hundreds of them, many with unjust outcomes. The debate was technical, but it wasn't academic. Real people had lost jobs, children, homes because of rulings handed down under bias and financial influence. Then Judge Compton spoke. Retrospective justice is a slippery slope, she said coolly. We can't reverse every decision from a 20-year tenure. That would destabilize the system. Danielle didn't hesitate. The system has already been destabilized. People's lives were wrecked. Their records carry charges they never should have received. Families were broken. Stability isn't a reason to avoid responsibility. There was a tension in the room now. Compton leaned back, adjusting her glasses. You're asking us to unravel years of precedent based on emotional response. Danielle's voice didn't rise, but it cut sharper. No. I'm asking you to confront the reality that precedent built on injustice isn't precedent worth preserving. Silence followed. Then one of the advocates, a young attorney named Leon with a background in public defense, spoke up. We could appoint an independent review committee. Start with the most egregious cases. Offer expungement where misconduct is proven. It's not perfect, but it's something. Danielle nodded. Start there. Make it real. That moment marked a shift. Not just in the meeting, but in Danielle's role. She wasn't just the whistleblower anymore. She was becoming a strategist. A builder of what came next. But with that rise came new weight. With every reform proposed, every case reviewed, new dilemmas emerged. What happens to the people who benefited from Whitaker's favoritism? Should they face penalties too? Could justice ever truly be retroactive without becoming punitive in itself? Later that week, Danielle sat across from Malik in a quiet coffee shop, a stack of folders between them. He had started his own independent investigation group, focusing on cases impacted by judicial corruption, and they were working together more than ever. But there was a fatigue in his eyes now, the kind that came from realizing how deep the rot ran. He closed one of the folders and sighed. It's like pulling out one weed and finding a whole damn forest underneath. Danielle stirred her tea. You ever wonder if exposing it all makes things better, or just makes people more afraid of the system? He looked at her. You didn't expose the system to break it. You exposed it so we'd have no choice but to fix it. That kind of fear is necessary. She sat with that for a moment, then asked, do you think we can fix it? Malik didn't answer immediately. He looked past her, through the cafe window at the people walking by, lawyers, students, parents, strangers with their own battles. I don't know, he said finally. But I know if anyone can make them try, it's you. Outside, the weather had turned. Rain tapped gently on the windows, the city washed in a gray hue. Danielle leaned back and thought about the people whose names she'd carried into that courtroom, the ones who hadn't been able to speak for themselves. Gloria, the retired teacher. Marcus, the student whose life had derailed after a false contempt charge. Tasha, who risked everything to testify. The woman in the stairwell whose name she still didn't know. Justice didn't feel like a gavel slamming. It felt like holding the weight of all those voices and not dropping them. It felt like staying in the room even after the applause had faded. And yet, underneath all that resolve, a single question haunted her, one she had buried but never resolved. What if the woman who helped leak the documents had done it for a reason Danielle hadn't yet uncovered? She thought about her words again, I watched from behind a cracked door. That kind of language lingered. It implied more than regret. It hinted at knowledge. Participation, even. Danielle had begun tracing the financial records of Whitaker's known associates and found a few anomalies. Small, barely noticeable transactions tied to dormant legal accounts. There were no names, just numbers. But she had learned long ago that numbers told their own stories. And if her instincts were right, then the real web hadn't fully unraveled yet. Whitaker was just the first to fall. But what if there were others still in place, watching, waiting, hoping she'd stop now that justice had been served on the surface? That was the new dilemma. She could step back now, accept the recognition, the influence, the chance to rebuild. Or she could keep going. Keep digging. Knowing it might cost her more. Knowing it might expose people who had once helped her. People who wore guilt like armor. People who had buried their sins so deeply in good deeds that unearthing them might undo everything. Danielle stood at a crossroads where justice and mercy blurred, where survival met principle. The system wanted her to fix it, but fixing required more than bandages. It meant breaking what was left, and risking who might be broken with it. And as she walked home that night, the city's lights flickering across rain-soaked pavement, she realized something. The fight wasn't over. Danielle sat alone in her living room, the clock ticking loudly in a room that hadn't known silence in weeks. Her laptop was open in front of her, documents layered across the screen like a spider's web, financial ledgers, court case histories, obscure ethics committee memos, encrypted communications from whistleblowers. The glow of the screen was the only light in the room, casting faint shadows against her tired face. Her fingers hovered above the keys, but she wasn't typing. Not yet. Her mind kept drifting back to that woman in the stairwell. There had been something deliberate in her presence, something that didn't settle right. Danielle wasn't suspicious by nature, but she was thorough. And something about that encounter, the timing, the words chosen so carefully, it gnawed at her, not with fear, but with the unease of an unfinished equation. She reached for her phone and called Malik. His voice came through groggy, laced with sleep. She didn't apologize. She couldn't. There was something she needed to say and it couldn't wait. I don't think the leak came out of guilt, she said quietly. There was a pause. Danielle, it doesn't matter. It worked. You exposed him. No, listen, she insisted. I think she was part of it. Not just a bystander. I think she was complicit before she became helpful. I think she wants to rewrite her own role. Malik sighed heavily. Do you have proof? Not yet, she said. But I have a theory. He was quiet for a while, then finally asked, if she was involved, what does that change? Everything, Danielle whispered. Because it means this didn't happen because one man went rogue. It means there was a network. People who enabled him. Maybe even benefited. Malik's voice was sharper now. You're talking about something bigger than corruption. You're talking about institutional complicity. You're not just chasing one judge now, you're chasing the foundation. Danielle leaned forward, elbows on her knees. I don't want to be chasing anything. But I can't ignore it either. The next morning, she met with Angela at a quiet corner of the university library. They spread documents across the table, lowering their voices despite the lack of students around. Angela listened carefully as Danielle outlined the inconsistencies, financial transfers, witness statements that contradicted timelines, a legal firm tied to the private probation company suddenly dissolving just before the scandal broke. Angela tapped her fingers against her chin. If what you're saying is true, then someone higher up greenlit all of this. It's organized. Maybe not officially. But it's not random. I know, Danielle said. That's why I need your help. Not as a mentor. As a co-investigator. Angela gave a long look, then nodded once. All right. But we have to be careful. If we pull this thread, we have to be ready for what unravels. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, interviews, and hushed meetings. They revisited every name connected to the probation company. Danielle pored over bar records, committee logs, budget allocations. Patterns emerged, small at first, then unmistakable. A circuit of cases funneled towards certain firms. Probation sentences tied to programs that required defendants to pay fees directly to companies with links to campaign donors. It was bigger than Whitaker. It was systematic profiteering cloaked in legal formality. The deeper Danielle went, the more she realized that justice had been sold in pieces, quietly, strategically, and in plain sight. And then came the breaking point. Tasha Rivers called her in a panic, her voice strained and shaking. Someone's been in my apartment, she said. I came home and my files were moved. Nothing stolen. But someone was there. Danielle's stomach dropped. Did you call the police? They won't do anything, Tasha said bitterly. I don't even have proof. But I know it was a warning. Danielle pressed her lips together, heart pounding. Pack a bag. Come stay with me. We'll figure this out together. That night, the air in her apartment was heavy with tension. Tasha paced in the kitchen while Danielle reviewed the backups of her testimony. Malik joined them later, bringing food they didn't eat. No one said it aloud, but the fear had returned, the same kind of fear they thought had been buried with the scandal. Now it was back, sharper and quieter, dressed not in threats but in surveillance and shadows. Tasha finally spoke. I thought once he was gone, we'd be safe. But I was wrong. They don't care about him. They care about what comes next. Danielle nodded. And what comes next is exposure. All of it. But even as she said it, doubt crept in. Because she had begun to understand that justice had a cost. Not just emotional. Not just professional. It chipped away at you, slowly. Every truth you revealed demanded a piece of your safety. Every lie you dismantled left someone desperate to build it back. The next day, she was approached by a man in a parking garage. Not threatening, not armed, just calmly dressed, polished, and unassuming. He introduced himself with a smile that never reached his eyes. "You've done impressive work, Ms. Brooks," he said. "But sometimes, knowing when to stop is part of wisdom too." Danielle didn't flinch. "Is that a threat?" "It's advice," he replied smoothly. "You've won. The public sees you as a hero. But heroes don't stay heroes when they start digging into things people want left buried." She stared at him, expression unreadable. "If you're part of it, tell your people this: I don't scare easy. And I don't stop when I'm close." He gave a small shrug. "Then maybe you'll understand the cost." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the concrete stillness. That night, Danielle didn't sleep. She lay in bed thinking about Ava. About Tasha. About every name on her spreadsheets. About the weight of truth. She thought about stopping. She really did. Not because she was afraid, but because she was tired. Because even warriors have limits. Because justice, as beautiful as it sounded, was a brutal path to walk alone. But then she remembered the woman in the stairwell. The one who'd carried her guilt like a torch. And she realized this wasn't just about Whitaker anymore. It never had been. She got out of bed before dawn, made a pot of coffee, and sat down with her laptop. If the foundation was rotten, it had to be exposed. Because the truth wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of what she owed to everyone who still couldn't speak. Danielle had never been afraid of confrontation, not in the way that left you trembling, unsure, paralyzed. What unsettled her now was the silence between confrontations, the inescapable quiet where her mind filled in every gap with possible threats, unseen forces, and the knowledge that her choices now had consequences that could ripple far beyond her own life. For weeks, she had kept her head low, working methodically from home, only emerging for key meetings, always with caution. She wasn't paranoid, not exactly. But something had shifted. People were watching. Not just the public. Not just the press. But those who had everything to lose if the full truth ever surfaced. Her investigation into Whitaker had uncovered only the surface of a much deeper rot, and the more she pulled the threads of those backroom deals and interconnected decisions, the more clearly she saw that this wasn't about one judge or one court, it was about an entire ecosystem of corruption that had learned to survive by blending in with the law itself. The break came from a former judicial assistant named Darren Lewis. He was young, smart, and until recently, relatively quiet. But Malik had reached out to him through a mutual contact, and something in the timing must have aligned because Darren agreed to meet. The three of them sat in the back of a dusty old library on the east side of town, the kind of place no one thought to visit anymore, surrounded by forgotten books and silence. Darren looked over his shoulder constantly, his fingers tapping the table. But when he finally spoke, it was with purpose. "I was told to destroy files," he said plainly. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the list. Danielle leaned forward, eyebrows tight. "What list?" He looked at her carefully. "A list of people flagged as non-compliant. They weren't criminals. Just inconvenient. People who questioned the court's authority, people who filed too many appeals, people who challenged officers. They were monitored. Their cases were shuffled to specific judges. It wasn't random." Malik's face darkened. "That's not just corruption. That's targeting." Darren nodded. "They called it administrative filtering. But it was punishment. I saw names appear again and again, wrongfully evicted, licenses suspended, kids taken. And then one day I saw yours, Ms. Brooks." Danielle's throat tightened, but she didn't let it show. "And who ran it?" Darren exhaled. "It wasn't just Whitaker. He was the face. The coordinator was someone inside the Judicial Oversight Office. I don't know who exactly. But I can tell you where the records were stored. Not on court servers. On a private cloud system. Angela was brought in the next day to help trace the storage network. Within 48 hours, they located a secure folder hidden behind layers of encryption, paid for through shell company accounts. When they finally broke through, what they found was devastating. Dozens of profiles, dates, internal notes, transcripts of courtroom behavior. It was surveillance disguised as bureaucracy, punishment masked as legal process. Danielle's profile was there, complete with annotations. The words, persistent, non-submissive, likely to appeal, glared back at her like scars she hadn't known existed. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She sat in silence for a long moment, then stood and walked out of the room, into the parking lot. Malik followed quietly, keeping his distance. When he finally caught up to her, she had her hands pressed against the hood of her car, staring at the sky. "They catalogued me like I was a problem to manage," she said. "You were a threat," Malik replied softly. "They were right about that." Danielle turned toward him, her eyes glassy but hard. "I want every person on that list to know what was done to them. I want it public. Not buried in an ethics review. I want faces. Names. I want accountability." Malik didn't flinch. "Then let's go get it." But that decision came with a weight Danielle hadn't fully anticipated. The more they prepared to go public, the more resistance they met. Journalists who had once cheered her bravery now hesitated, afraid the story would implicate too many powerful figures. Institutions that had awarded her began distancing themselves, issuing statements about the importance of responsible disclosure. Even the legal clinic she had once worked for quietly asked her to step back from guest lectures. Danielle wasn't being attacked outright. She was being silenced politely, systematically, through discomfort, bureaucracy, and doubt. The tension culminated during a panel discussion at a local university, where Danielle had been invited to speak on justice reform. The auditorium was full, but the energy was restrained. The moderator, a seasoned academic, smiled politely and moved the conversation along with the ease of someone who knew which lines not to cross. But when the audience was allowed to ask questions, a young woman in the third row stood up. "I'm a law student," she said, "and I've followed your story. My question is, how do you keep going when even the people you thought were allies begin to pull away?" Danielle paused. The microphone was hot in her hand. The question echoed louder than anything she had expected. "I used to think the hard part was being unheard," she began. "But the truth is, the hardest part is being heard, and still being told you're too much. Too angry. Too persistent. I've lost friends. I've been told I'm risking my career. But what no one seems to ask is what happens to the people who never had a voice to begin with. I can survive discomfort. What I can't survive is pretending this didn't happen." The room was silent for a long time after she spoke. And in that silence, something shifted again. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But in the nods of the students, in the quiet murmurs afterward. Her words didn't spark applause. They sparked reflection. After the event, Angela pulled her aside. "They're scared, Danielle," she said gently. "Not of you. Of what you represent. You didn't just expose a broken system. You made it undeniable. And that kind of truth doesn't get rewarded. It gets resisted." Danielle exhaled, tired. "Then we keep resisting too." Angela hesitated. "There's something else," she said. "I got a call from a contact in the state's attorney's office. An official investigation is being opened. But off the record, they're concerned. They think going public with the list could incite lawsuits, unrest, backlash. They want to contain it." Danielle's jaw tightened. "They want me to protect the people who let this happen. They're asking you to weigh the consequences," Angela said softly. "And to decide if exposure is worth the damage." That night, Danielle stood in front of her bathroom mirror, staring at herself. She didn't look like a hero. She looked like a woman caught in a storm of her own making. And yet, she knew what she had to do. Because protecting the powerful from discomfort had never protected the powerless from harm. She walked into the press briefing the next morning with her head high. Cameras flashed. Microphones angled toward her like weapons. Her voice didn't shake. "This isn't about vengeance," she said. "It's about transparency. Every name on that list deserves to know. Every family broken by that system deserves to understand what happened and why. Justice cannot exist without accountability. And silence is not protection. It's complicity." The reaction was immediate. Some called her reckless. Others called her a truth-teller. But most importantly, people listened. And in the days that followed, survivors came forward. Voices long buried began to speak. The city braced itself for a reckoning. But Danielle knew the hardest decision still lay ahead. Because one of the names on that list, the list of collaborators, those who allowed it to continue, was someone no one had expected. Someone whose name she had trusted. Someone who had once whispered, "You were remarkable in there." And now Danielle had to decide, would she expose them too? Or would she protect the person who had helped her, even if they had once been part of the very machine she fought to destroy? The fight for justice had brought her to the edge of truth. And now, she stood face to face with the price of it. Danielle stood at the edge of the courtroom once again, though not as a defendant, not as a witness, not even as an investigator. This time, she stood as a force. The air around her was thick with quiet anticipation. The list had been released. The names were known. And now, there were consequences that could not be undone. The city, the legal system, the people, everyone had to face what had been ignored for too long. Among the names exposed, one had stunned even her. The woman from the stairwell. The one who had whispered guidance, who had made herself a silent ally. Her name had surfaced on the list not only as a participant in a filtering system, but as one of the original architects of the file categorization methods that allowed targeting to begin. It was a betrayal hidden beneath remorse. And Danielle now held the power to expose or protect her. The decision was hers alone. She spent days weighing that choice, reading and rereading the documents, watching the videos of testimonies, feeling the pulse of the public swell with both outrage and fatigue. Malik, always honest, had told her he would support either path she chose, but reminded her of what they had built, of how truth was what had carried her this far. Angela, too, advised caution but left her no illusions. Protecting anyone now could create cracks in the foundation she had worked so hard to rebuild. Danielle eventually requested a private meeting with the woman. They sat across from one another in a nondescript office, blinds drawn, tension coiling in the silence between them. The woman's eyes were heavy with shame as she confessed everything. How it had started as a compliance project, how it spiraled into something far darker, and how she had stayed quiet for years until Danielle's case reminded her of everything she had allowed to happen. Her remorse was real. Her help had been genuine. But the truth remained, she had helped create a machine that consumed lives. Danielle listened. She didn't interrupt. When the woman finished, Danielle spoke quietly but with clarity. She didn't promise to keep her name off the record. What she did promise was to make sure that the entire truth was told, including who stepped forward to dismantle the system and why. She gave her the opportunity to testify publicly and own her story. The woman accepted. Her testimony was televised. Raw. Painful. Honest. And in that moment, something unexpected happened. Instead of public fury, there was a surge of collective reckoning. The city didn't collapse under the weight of its guilt. It began to heal. Because accountability isn't just about punishment, it's about acknowledgement, growth, and responsibility. Danielle's decision not to destroy the woman but to demand accountability from her helped redefine the tone of justice reform across the state. Other names followed suit. More people came forward. Some resigned. Some were charged. Others began to cooperate. What had begun as an exposé evolved into a complete overhaul of internal judicial policies, court procedures, and legal oversight structures. The filtering system was dismantled. A new independent review board was installed. The state passed the Brooks Judicial Transparency Act, requiring detailed public reporting of judicial behavior metrics, courtroom disparities, and ethics compliance. Danielle, despite being offered a dozen roles in law firms, political offices, and national media, chose a different path. She founded the Integrity Project, an independent institute for community justice education, systemic accountability, and legal empowerment, focusing particularly on equipping young Black professionals to reshape the future of law. The institute grew rapidly, with chapters in multiple cities and partnerships with universities and legal organizations. She traveled, lectured, trained, but always returned to Birmingham, because she knew that roots mattered more than reputation. Tasha Rivers, now a key member of the Integrity Project, became a specialist in data ethics and documentation integrity. She rebuilt her life brick by brick, becoming a voice for whistleblowers and survivors alike. Her presence alone reminded everyone that silence once forced can become advocacy by choice. Malik expanded his investigation firm into a statewide network, creating a space for legal professionals disillusioned with traditional institutions to fight from the outside in. His work with Danielle only deepened. Together, they created legal training programs rooted not in theory, but in the lived experience of those harmed by the system. And Judge Whitaker? He was convicted on multiple charges: fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. His sentencing was broadcast live. No robe. No gavel. Just a man forced to sit in the very chair he had once used to diminish others. His final statement expressed regret, but the room knew what regret sounded like when it came too late. His conviction wasn't just a punishment, it was a public acknowledgement that no one, not even the law itself, was above the people it claimed to serve. Years later, Danielle would walk into a courtroom again, not as a symbol, but as counsel in a major class action case for hundreds of defendants who had suffered under the filtering system. She stood with them. She spoke for them. And when the case was won, when the state was forced to pay reparations and issue formal public apologies, she stepped back from the microphone and let one of the victims tell their story instead. Because power, for her, was never the goal. Dismantling the myth of who holds it, that was the mission. This story isn't about one woman's victory. It's about the resilience that grows in silence, the brilliance that burns even under oppression, and the way justice can emerge not with vengeance, but with clarity. Danielle Brooks didn't win because she was exceptional. She won because she believed that ordinary people armed with truth could bend even the most rigid systems towards something more human, more honest, more whole. Now, to you who have listened to this story, let me ask you something. How many moments have passed in your life where silence felt safer than resistance? How many times have you seen something wrong and convinced yourself it wasn't your fight? And what if the line between justice and injustice isn't drawn by laws or judges, but by our own willingness to speak when it's hard, to stand when it's risky, to choose truth when comfort beckons? Danielle's story is a reminder that the system doesn't change itself. It takes someone who refuses to sit quietly. Someone who dares to believe that truth is louder than power. If this story moved you, if it made you question, reflect, or simply feel seen, I want to invite you to join our growing community. Subscribe to Tales of Twist, where we tell the stories that challenge what we think we know, stories of justice, resilience, and the human spirit rising against all odds. And don't forget to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and tell us, if you were Danielle, what would you have done? We'll be reading. We'll be listening. And we'll be back with another twist you won't see coming.